Okay, well, I'm Christine Shawcroft from the London Region Committee. Thank you, everybody, for joining this meeting. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion. I'll take obviously I'll be taking the speakers first, and then if you want to ask a question or add to the discussion, you can put your hand up afterwards. I'm going to be taking Carol, and then Tom, and then Sophie, and then towards the end of the meeting, there'll be chance for the speakers to come back on the questions or any points raised. Okay. Right. So the first speaker we have is Carol Turner, who's the chair of the London Region CND, and she's going to be speaking about what is behind the war in Ukraine. Okay, Carol.
Thanks, Sophie. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm swapping from my screen to my notes so I don't dribble on for hours and hours. Please give me some indication or, if necessary, turn me off if I overrun my time. I'll try not to. Okay, so as Christine says, you're hearing other aspects of this from Tom and Sophie. I want to say something about the course of the war itself, and especially some of the things the government and our fact-checking obsessed media are not telling us about the war. Okay, there are four reasons why Britain is a direct target in the Ukraine war, which is something that the government and the media are definitely not telling us about. One is Trident, we're a nuclear weapons state, and we've got a first use nuclear strategy. The second is NATO. We're a member of NATO and an important European ally of the United States. The third reason is we're one of NATO's European nuclear bases, Lakenheath, which I'm sure Sophie will say more about. And the fourth is that the UK is a strong supporter of the Ukraine government, the third biggest donator after the United States and Germany. Britain supplied Challenger tanks, which were used in the Kursk offensive in August, the short-range missiles. We're the first country to sign a bilateral security agreement with Ukraine in January. We provided £2.6 billion for Ukraine, more for Ukraine in the budget last month. President Putin regards NATO allies as entering the war on the side of Ukraine. He said this as a result of the use of short-range missiles in August, and he's repeated it and strengthened his nuclear doctrine as the current course of the war, the use of longer-range missiles, has advanced. Okay. So we're all waiting for President Trump to be inaugurated on the 20th of January, and the world wants to see if he is in fact capable of brokering a ceasefire and what those terms might be. No point at this stage in us discussing that. We simply need to wait and see. What we know is that for 2 years, President Zelensky has toured European capitals and attended international conferences proposing his own peace plan. It's a plan which excludes Russia from the negotiating table, and so, at least in my opinion, is no peace plan at all. But with the election of Trump, Zelensky came up beginning of last week with another so-called peace proposal. And what he said is that he is prepared to freeze the hot war as it is and take and stop military fighting, basically, in return for NATO accepting the membership of Ukraine. I think this is no more of a peace proposal than calling for negotiations without Russia present. So to understand the war in Ukraine, what we need to do is look at the goals of the Russian and Ukrainian government. And it doesn't mean we're supporting Putin or Zelensky. It means understanding what the real security concerns of each side are. So let me deal first with Russia and Putin's goals. In the early stages of the war, Russia targeted Kiev and western parts of the country, and that led to speculation that Putin sought to conquer the whole of Ukraine, reincorporate it into a post-Soviet Greater Russia, if you like. That's the way in which some of our media talks about it. And that debate continues. And it's one of the ways in which NATO allies attempt to maintain the image of Putin as an evil monster, to put it in sort of red top newspaper terms. However, the course of the war lends support to a rather different view of what Russia's strategic objectives are, and they're threefold. First of all, and probably the most important strategic goal, is to prevent the encirclement of Russia by NATO as bordering states join the alliance. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO looked to expand. And from 1997 onwards, it admitted the first East European former Soviet bloc members. And today it is in fact correct that Russia is surrounded by NATO members and NATO partners. The second of Russia's objectives is to protect the Ukrainians' ethnic Russian population. It's largely, but not entirely, in the east and southeast of Ukraine, and have no doubt it's a goal which Russian public opinion supports very strongly indeed. The cultural ties are real, they go back many decades, centuries even. And in the case of Ukraine, with a few brief exceptions, in the case of Crimea, with a few brief exceptions, it's been part of Russia for a very long time. The third, and probably the least talked about goal, is that Russia is a landlocked or almost landlocked country with a big border, and it is concerned to protect its access to world's ocean and seas. That's strategically important to Russia, not just for military, but also for trade reasons. And Putin believes that Russia's access is increasingly threatened by the United States. If we look at Zelensky and his goals, he wants full NATO membership and EU membership. But we should take into account that to date, the Biden administration hasn't supported NATO membership, which would be seen as a huge escalation on the part of the allies. NATO membership would include, for example, Ukraine providing NATO with access to territory and airspace, potentially facilitating a conventional or even a nuclear attack. And to my knowledge, Tom might know better than I on this one, but to my knowledge, no anti-missile defences exist that would enable Russia to withstand a nuclear attack that took place so close to its borders. So with the backing of NATO allies, President Zelensky's additional aims are restoring the country's 1991 borders, it includes Crimea, and the Biden administration does not believe that incorporating Crimea into Ukraine is an achievable goal, and it doesn't support it, and it said so on a few occasions, but this is not very well broadcast.
2 minutes.
Sorry, did someone
Sorry,
say?
2 minutes.
Thank you.
Sorry,
thanks. So I suspect, although we don't know till the end of January, that Trump will be likely to rule this out, some of his strategy, Republican strategists and his advisors have suggested this. Okay, that's to move to the second part of what I'm saying quickly, and that is the way in which Ukraine war impacts. So let me just cut a bit out of my notes. So in early August, we had the use of short-range missiles. That, as everybody knows, expanded. I'm not going to talk about the current situation, but I just wanted to note a couple of details which hopefully everyone will be as aware of as I am. First of all, that Russia has adapted its nuclear strategy. It's now includes using nuclear weapons against states that it's at war with. It's focused particularly on the NATO allies, and it has a new weapon. I think we're going to be hearing more about this from Tom, so I'm not at this point going to say anything except to make one point. There's been a lot of media discussion about Russia's expanded capability, and the significance of that is that it's a message from Russia saying, in the case of us using this missile, then we can remove your ability to NATO to protect Europe. That's what the message and the warning is. So I'm going to leave it there with one final comment, if I may, Christine, and that is something that is increasingly left out of the discussion about the war in Ukraine, and that is the people of Ukraine themselves. Starmer and Biden and other NATO allies frequently talk about protecting the Ukrainian people. What we should be aware of is that Ukraine's population before the war was 42 million, according to a census. The UN estimates that the population today in 2024 is in the region of 37.9 million. That's a result of war deaths, of refugee migration, a drop in the birth rate, and to some extent, the loss of territory. And the UN predicts that at this rate, the population will drop to 15.3 million by the end of the century. In my opinion, this is not protecting the people of Ukraine. And what in fact is clear, despite the media, is that Ukraine war has two aspects, the second aspect of which is a proxy war between two nuclear armed powers, Russia and NATO. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Carol. Some really important points raised there. Welcome to everyone who's just joined the meeting. We're taking two more speakers, and then we'll be asking if anyone wants to ask any questions or make any contributions or whatever, and you'll need to indicate digitally with your hand up to do that. So our next speaker is Tom Unterrainer, who's the chair of National CND, and he's going to be speaking about aspects of war in Europe and the possibilities of escalation across Europe. Okay, Tom.
Thank you, Christine. I've set my timer, so if you hear beeping in the background and I'm still rambling on, please tell me to shut up. Look, we're meeting, and we've called this meeting because we are in a dangerous situation. I think all of us appreciate that. All of us appreciate and have appreciated for a very long time the danger that potential nuclear use could present. CND is not saying, and we're very clear on this, and we need to be clear on this, CND is not saying that nuclear use is an imminent risk. You know, we're not calling on people to head to the hills or to find a bunker or to say their last goodbyes. We're not in that place. I mean, I'll come on to a bit more of that in a bit, perhaps if I have some time. But what we are saying to our members, and by way of that, to the British general public and to the political leaders in this country, is that you know the current strategy being undertaken by Britain NATO member states and others in relation to what is happening in Ukraine has massively increased already very sharply posed nuclear risks and nuclear tensions, and that we need to step back from that. There has to be a way to step back from that, and that has to be the prime responsibility of our government, and therefore our efforts in making sure that that question and that need is raised very sharply and very energetically is what we are all about. But nevertheless, the situation is incredibly dangerous, and it's dangerous for a number of reasons, not least because of the actual existing, what they call security architecture, what our leaders and what other nuclear armed states consider to be their nuclear posture. The question of when do we get to the point where we might even contemplate engaging in or starting nuclear war. And that level has been massively degraded. The chain of events, the sequence of things that would have to happen, has shortened, and the risks have increased. So the sequence of things, the sequence of steps in place has been truncated massively. And that process hasn't just happened over the past few weeks. It hasn't just happened over the duration of the war in Ukraine. It's been happening for some time. And most intensely, it happened under the first Trump presidency, where a whole series of agreements, treaties, and so on and so forth between the nuclear armed states were not just put to one side, but were deliberately and deliberately sabotaged. There was a bonfire of these treaties. The norms that for a certain period of time made it look as if the risk of anybody contemplating nuclear use had massively diminished. All of that infrastructure, all of that architecture was demolished. And it didn't just start under Trump. It started under the first Bush administration in the early 2000s with the destruction of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And from that point onwards, the escalator of these events has moved to the point where we are now. And that's important to register, because a lot of the narrative, a lot of the reasoning we see, both from our own leaders and in the national press and more widely, present the escalation with respect to Ukraine as wholly one-sided. Now, the Russian government, in the course of their invasion and occupation of Ukraine, has done a number of things which have massively increased nuclear tensions, not least Putin's public pronouncements and public threats, and not just him, others in the administration, including the use more recently of this hypersonic missile, which I'll come to in a moment. But this is not an asymmetric situation. And as Carol explained, it's linked to the expansion of a nuclear armed alliance across Europe. It's linked to an ongoing process of threatening and trying to contain Russia by use of a nuclear armed alliance, so on and so forth. But let's just look at two examples if I have time. First example, a lot of noise and fuss, and quite rightly, from CND's perspective, was made of the fact that Russia has now deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus. How did that happen? Why did that come about? Well, prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Belarus announced a constitutional amendment, a constitutional referendum to remove their nuclear-free status. So in a way, it had nothing to do with what was happening in Ukraine or went on to happen in Ukraine, but was absolutely linked to what was happening under the first Trump administration, where the nuclear blueprint of the United States in Europe was expanding in a whole number of ways. It was intimately linked to the fact that the right-wing Polish government at the time was positively saying to the United States and to NATO, we will host US nuclear weapons in this country, bordering where? Bordering Belarus. This expansion of the nuclear blueprint has been one of the main drivers of these risks. More recently, a lot has been said about the use of this new hypersonic missile in a test, as the Russians say, over just the past few days. And indeed, this weapon is formidable. It's nuclear capable. It was not nuclear armed, the one that was used in a test. It wasn't fired on Poland on an anti-missile base. I think if it had been fired on Poland, we'd be in a much more extreme situation than we are now. But nevertheless, it destroyed an enormous area. It was incredibly powerful. It was a bunker buster type weapon that created a huge amount of damage, even without nuclear warheads aboard. Another massive escalation, we are told, by the Russian government. But what we're not told, or not told in any detail, is the fact that for a number of years, the United States has been developing its own hypersonic weapon system, which it names Dark Eagle, that this weapon system has been repeatedly tested over and over again. We're not told that last year, the United States Air Force identified a base in Germany, which would be the command and control center for the eventual deployment of these hypersonic weapon systems in Germany. And nobody, apart from a few of us around the disarmament movement and anti-war movement, have pointed out that the base that they've identified in Germany, which will be the command and control center for this new hypersonic nuclear-capable weapon system, is exactly the same base that was the command and control center for the Pershing missiles in the 1980s. This has been going on for years. It's a symmetrical set of developments, and for all the reasons that we've already outlined, it is incredibly dangerous indeed. I've got about 1 minute 30 seconds left, so I'll try and speed up slightly. So in accounting for everything that is happening, we need to be clear, yes, of the risks. We need to be clear, yes, of the history, in particular, of Ukraine. We need to be clear about what this all means. But we also have to be clear about where the responsibility for stepping back resides, where it resides, and why it is so important. And that does mean we have to focus very much first on our own government. Second, we need to be very clear about what our government's intimate military relationship with the United States actually means and what we might be dragged into as a result of whatever the second Trump presidency does. We need to be absolutely clear about what NATO is all about and the fact that nuclear weapons are a central part of this alliance. We need to be clear about how NATO expansion and how NATO behavior has led to the whole destabilization of this system. The last thing we need to be clear about is that Trump won the first Trump presidency, through petrol on this bonfire of treaties. The last thing standing is the New START treaty, which is due to be renegotiated under Trump and Putin by, I think, January 2026. At the minute, it looks very unlikely that they will get anywhere close to that negotiation. Let's hope I'm wrong. But it's also true that a whole number of things that Biden could have done during his presidency, like reinstituting the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, he could have done it. He could have done it. He could have done the same with the JCPOA or the Iran deal. The Open Skies Treaty, they could have engaged in, resurrecting that. This is the arrangement whereby you can make observations of and collect details from nuclear facilities across countries. A lot of these are bilateral. A lot of these are at presidential initiative. Biden did nothing at all, which leaves us now in a situation where things are even more degraded. What will Trump do? As Carol says, there's no point in speculating. We don't know, but we saw the record. We see the risks that present themselves now. We see what our government is saying, which is why we as CND need to not just redouble or triple or quadruple our efforts, but make sure we have a united, determined effort to speak clearly on these things, explain exactly the role of our government in this situation, sound the alarm, and make sure that we bring very, very many people on the streets and elsewhere with us, because this is, as I opened with, an incredibly dangerous situation. I'm sorry for the disruption earlier. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. So our next speaker is Sophie Bolt, who's our brand new General Secretary in CND. And when Sophie's finished, we're going to be, if people want to ask questions or make comments, then if they can indicate, and we'll take you. So Sophie's going to be talking about the US and British role in the escalation of these wars. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks, and thanks very much to London Region CND for organising this this discussion. Very important. And yes, I am new to the role of General Secretary. In fact, I've been in post for 1 month, and today, in fact, and it's very, very, very busy, but it's a complete honour, but also a massive responsibility. So as people have said, very, very serious escalation in Ukraine. It's an incredibly serious time for our movement, and it's absolutely critical that we completely turn around this situation. As people have said, Trump's election in itself is a very dangerous escalation for the whole world, based on his track record. Tom was of outlining this, but also, bombing Syria, bombing Iraq, as well as pulling out of these key arms control treaties. But also now looking at the ultra hawks that he's bringing into the State Department. So we've got people like Mark Rubio and Mike Waltz. These are really serious, hawks who've played, a really, really terrible role when Trump was in office previously. And, it makes the sort of the threat of war and the risk of nuclear confrontation higher than ever. And certainly his election is already impacting the situation in Ukraine. Biden's response to Trump's election, is completely to massively escalate this situation in Ukraine. I mean, he's claiming that Trump will, bring the war to a rapid conclusion. Sorry, this is Trump's claim, but obviously we have absolutely no certainty of this or whatever such a rapid conclusion looks like. So, despite concerns by Biden that giving Ukraine the use of these long-range army tactical missile systems, or ATACMS, as they call them, would draw NATO, the biggest nuclear armed, military alliance in the world, into an all-out confrontation with Russia. This is what Biden has now done. And the British government has followed suit with the Storm Shadows, although it still will not publicly admit that it gave permission to this terribly escalatory and dangerous act. And the whole thing around why are these missiles so significant, the use of them so significant, it's because they can only be guided and targeted by the US technology, the GPS technology. So it basically means the US is decisively participating in this conflict. And of course, Russia, as people have said, has ratified the change of its nuclear use policy. This is, they made this absolutely clear. This is, directly in response to this escalation with the use of these long-range missiles. And so, the policy now states that the use of nuclear weapons, might be used against a conventional attack by a non-nuclear state if it is backed by a nuclear state. So this is NATO. This is NATO backing Ukraine. And as Tom's talked about, that Russia's also responded with this intermediate range hypersonic missile. So it's an incredibly, incredibly serious and rapid escalation. And the response of Europe and NATO, just last week, the group of 5, that's Germany, France, Italy, Poland and Britain, they all met and they issued a statement saying that they will continue to back and arm Ukraine. On Tuesday, there was an emergency Ukraine and NATO council meeting. And on the same day, the Secretary General Mark Rutte said, our support for Ukraine has kept them in the fight. But we need to go further to change the trajectory of the conflict. So all this continuing escalatory talk. But, in terms of what difference are these missiles actually making to the conflict? Military experts and diplomats across the political spectrum, including in Ukraine, have all said that the use of these weapons will make no decisive difference to the outcome of the war. In fact, reports show that Ukraine has lost 40% of the territory that it had gained in its offensive in Kursk in the summer. And it also, this escalation goes totally against Ukrainian public opinion. We know that there's a majority of the population in Ukraine now that want an urgent end to the war through peace talks. People might have seen the Gallup poll where there's just really precipitous, drop in support for the war, and we're now sort of seeing cases like, for instance, 60,000 cases of troops who have fled the battlefield and are now being prosecuted for that. But also across Western Europe, there's very, very large majorities of the population, like in the high 90s, that want an end to this suffering through a negotiated settlement. So, what is kind of driving this escalation? It looks to me like it's being determined by the domestic politics of the US. Biden trying to sort of secure a more favorable situation for Ukraine going into possible talks when Trump becomes president. But as I say, can Trump even secure such a ceasefire or a political settlement? There's absolutely no guarantee at all. Or is Biden, just trying to sort of stop, a Ukrainian military defeat while he is still president? While he wants to kind of push it onto Trump. Deeply, deeply reckless response that, as I say, is pushed us to this point where everybody has said we've got to pull back from the nuclear brink. So our work is to pressure our political leaders, and we've got to do that now. It's absolutely critical. And I wanted to kind of raise the issue that has been sort of muted around Trump and his sort of support for NATO and the possibilities of him sort of wanting to sort of pull NATO out of Europe. There's absolutely no evidence for that at all. We know that like he is absolutely no friend to the peace movement, and Trump's policies have always been America first. That's always been his policy. And so what we've seen going on already and under, his previous presidency is to be putting more pressure onto European states, European NATO states. So pushing for, 3% of defense spending to be, really upping that. But so basically for European NATO states to be shouldering the financial burden and the military burden of projecting US military and nuclear power across Europe. And that brings in, the situation we have in Britain. People refer to the US air base in Suffolk, Lakenheath. We've got overwhelming evidence that the US is going to be delivering new nuclear weapons, not just to Lakenheath, but across Europe. And the US has been planning that for years, way before the Ukrainian conflict, to strengthen its nuclear presence. So, and since 2021, here in Britain, these F-35A fighter jets, which I'm sure people are very familiar with in relation to the appalling role that they've played in Gaza, contributing to the genocidal slaughter of the Palestinian people. Well, these F-35A jets are based at Lakenheath. They've been there since 2021, and as well as the role that they've been playing in Gaza and other US-led wars, these jets are specially designed to launch these new nuclear bombs that the US has designed. And so we know that these fighter jets have already been involved in military exercises, with countries like the Netherlands readying themselves for a war with Russia. And as I say, there's overwhelming evidence that these nuclear bombs are going to be coming to Lakenheath, as well as to these NATO bases across Europe. The most recent information we've had about that is through satellite imagery that's showing that these nuclear shelters in Lakenheath have been upgraded, ready for these bombs. And the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, has just, recently announced saying that they've completed all the sort of the maintenance facilities for these F-35A fighter jets, and now they're moving on to build a whole new dormitory, which is for more US fighter pilots to come over from the States with their families. So, CND has launched a legal challenge against this, and we're going to be looking at other ways that we can launch another legal challenge on this. But this base is absolutely central to NATO's nuclear escalation, and we know that the news of Lakenheath being used to host US nuclear bombs provoked Russia to cite nuclear bombs in Belarus. Russia came out publicly to say, you're going to be having these nuclear bombs in Britain. We're going to cite nuclear bombs in Belarus, and that was the first time that it had cited nuclear weapons outside of its territory since the Cold War. So it basically means that Britain and the British population will be on the front line of any military or nuclear confrontation between NATO and Russia. And that's why our campaign against US bombs at Lakenheath is inexorably linked to our campaigning against this escalation in Ukraine. So Britain's role. Britain is like one of the most hawkish, if not the most hawkish, competing probably against Poland here in the NATO alliance. In the previous government led by Boris Johnson, he personally sabotaged peace talks brokered by Turkey in March 2022. That was just a month after the conflict started, to ensure Ukraine's NATO membership was not on the table for negotiation. We know it was Britain that sent radioactive depleted uranium munitions for use in Ukraine, clearly having no interest in the impact that was going to have, the toxic legacy that was going to have on the people of Ukraine. And now, we've seen it's the Starmer government that has continued this aggressive escalation. It was Starmer that was lobbying Biden back in the summer to use these long-range Storm Shadow missiles. And last week, Britain's Deputy Chief of Defence Staff at the Defence Select Committee, he was arguing, if the British Army was asked to fight tonight, it would fight tonight. This really reckless, blustering talk that's only further escalating tensions with Russia. And of course, we know that, this new government has made support for nuclear weapons and replacement a core issue for it. So, we can see the role that the British government is playing. So because of this situation, because the situation is so serious, we have called an emergency day of action on Saturday, the 7th of December. It's really, really important that everybody gets involved in this. There are actions taking place across the country. There are already actions planned in London, Manchester and Plymouth. For those of you who are based in London, we really encourage you to come to the protest that we're going to be having. It's at Downing Street, 2:30 p.m, as I say, on Saturday the 7th, to send a really, really strong message to Keir Starmer to pull back from the nuclear brink, to withdraw its shadow missiles from Ukraine, and to properly engage in peace talks, because we can make a difference. Protest always makes a difference. We've got public opinion on our side, and history shows that it's public protest that always stops these terrible escalations. Thanks.
Right, okay, thank you very much, Sophie.